you're already familiar with layers versus nodes, if you've been using something like Nuke or Fusion, then you can entirely skip this video. We are not really presenting how to use nodes. This is more talking about the overall concept of layers versus nodes. Layers are very straightforward and nodes can take a little bit of time to get your brain around. So we're just making a video just explaining that. So feel free to skip this if you already know what we're talking about. Now, we are going to be talking about layers first. Layers is a traditional way of working in software like Photoshop, Painter, or Mari. And this is the old school way of working. You can still use layers perfectly fine in Mari, but for the remaining of this series, we are going to be sticking with nodes. Nodes is the far more flexible system, though it also adds more complexity. So if you have something simple, you can feel free to use layers, but for something more complex, particularly if you're going to be working in a production, I highly recommend that you get used to using nodes. The gist of using layers is that each layer represents something. This can be, for instance, in this case, just a paint layer. It can be an adjustment layer like grade, so we can grade whatever is in here. It can be something like a procedural, so we can go in here, we can add clouds, and you can just see that this is just right on top of each other. If you want to paint on top of this, very easy to do. Just make a new layer, just paint, bake it down. If we want to grade all this, very nice and simple. We just go in and we just grade this. So far, this stuff here is very nice and simple to use. The problem arises if you are working with something more complicated. Let's say you have multiple masks that you keep using over and over again. This is how I'm often texturing. I often begin a project by painting tons of masks. You might have one around the eyes, one around the nose here, one around the lips. And the reason I'm doing this is because you keep reusing these things over and over again. For instance, for balancing your grades and for adjusting tileables, masking up procedurals. And this is something you just use all the time. So instead of having to copy the layers, we can just reference the layers, just link them into different nodes. But this becomes very painful if you're dealing with layers. Let me show you a quick setup, which is something you'll be doing a lot when you're painting. One is where we are going to be using tiles. So you can just hit the tab key, type tile. And you can see here now the first one is marked, so you don't have to write anything more, tiled. And from the Windows Explorer, just in my second monitor now, you can just drag this from the Explorer directly in here. You don't have to bring this into the image manager, for instance. You can just drag it right in here. You can just change the repeat, right? So, you know, nothing fancy here, just a tile. And then we can grade this. So we can go in here and we can just grade this, make this darker or make this brighter. So very nice and simple when it comes to this. We can paint on top of this as well. So nothing too complicated. Now we just have 3 layers and we were able to make a tiled, a grade, and a painting. This is a really common workflow for texturing where you start off with just a tile image, then you grade the image to fit something else in your scene or to just modify it to some degree, and then you paint something on top. Just pretend that what we did here looked nice. Now let's talk about how we can do this in a nodal workflow. Now if you were to just open up the node graph here, you can see that this actually creates nodes for us. The problem with this is that we're now mixing layers and nodes, so this gets just really complicated. So in this case, it actually works all right, but we are just going to essentially just recreate this entire thing because this stuff here just gets complicated if you're starting to mix things. So I highly recommend that you don't mix layers and nodes. You can technically do it if you know what you're doing, but I really advise against it. The gist of how nodes work is that we are going from the left to the right. You can also go from the top to the bottom. If you prefer that, you can change this in the settings. But in this case, we are working from the left to the right. Here we have a node that's a color node. This is what gives this color right here. And then we have a paint node that is right here. And this contains nothing at the moment. This is just a layer. This is just a straight up empty layer. Now, the complexity of nodes comes from the fact that you have to merge things. At least in a lot of cases, this is one of the reasons that you add complexity, because you can't just add one on top of another. You have to merge them together. So you can make a merge by hitting the M key. We'll cover all this later on in the next chapter, specifically how you do this. But this is the gist of it. So if you have a color on the bottom and then you have a paint on top, you cannot just add them on top of each other. You have to go through our merge. If you want to mask this out, you can also add the mask slot as well. So how do we recreate the example we had before? Well, in this case, we can simply just remove anything that's here. this Control X, we can just delete this as well. That's fine. Then we can type tiled. And now we have a tile, double click it, and now you see it's up here. Then we just drag this from the Explorer into this. And now we can put this into the output. This is just going to be the channel. Now you can see this is exactly the same. Now, if we hit the 1 key, you can just see the viewer. So they'll connect this to a viewer. The viewer is what you're seeing things through. Again, more on this in the future chapters. So now we have a tiled. Let's say we want to grade this. We can hit G, type grade, and we have to use a merge for this to work correctly, at least if we want to mask this out. You could technically just go in here and grade this up, but if you want to mask this out to n degree, this is not going to work. So in this case, you're going to have to take the input in here, and you're going to have to make a merge node, connect this up, and make this go over. And now if we hit the 1 key here, you can see we can now go here and we can just grade this. So now we can make this brighter or darker. So this is exactly the same, but you can see how much more complicated this is compared to just making another tiled and making a grade on top of it. Now, if we want to paint on top of this as well, we can of course do that, but then we have to make a new paint layer. We have to hit the P key, and now we have to add something to this. In this case, we have to actually know something about the size, the bit depth. In this case, we are just going to make this transparent, and that's okay. So now we have a paint layer. And if you hit the 1 key, you can see this is transparent. Now we can hit M for merge, just drag this in here. And now we can go and we can add this to an over. And now if we hit the 1 key here, we can, and this is selected, we can now see we can paint. So this is now exactly the same as what we had before. So why on earth would we use nodes versus layers when this was so much simpler to do in layers? Well, for example like this, if this is the only thing you have to do, it might not make sense. Like if you literally only have one tiled and you're just painting like this, like even using Mario for this is a bit superfluous. Like then you can almost get away with just tiling this in something like Blender or in Maya. But if you are doing something that requires you to paint a lot of masks or you reuse things all the time, then this is massively beneficial. Let me show you what I mean. So hit P and we can just make this black now, and we can just make some quick masks. So don't worry exactly what I'm doing. The only thing you should worry about now is that we can just paint some masks for this. So we can just paint whatever. We're just going to paint some white here, give him some eyebrows or something. We can make another one here. We can make this like whatever this kind of stuff is here. So now we have two. We have this and we have this. Now we can reuse these over and over and over again. So for instance, if you have a roughness value down here, so well, if you want to modify the roughness, you can easily do that as well by using these layers here. These can be connected to multiple channels. So in this case, let's say we want to mask out what we just did here. We can now take this and we can mask this out. And now this is going to only affect this tiny area. You can see here, let's just do something more extreme. So you can see this now affects this one. But if you have another one, in this case, let's say you want to do the same thing down here in the roughness. Let's say you want to grade this as well. Exactly the same system as we had before. And now we want to mask this out. So let's say you want to make this brighter or darker now. We want to make this a lot brighter in that area. Then we can still use the same mask for this. So now you can see that this mask here is affecting two inputs at once. So we are both modifying the diffuse, in this case, the albedo, and we are modifying the roughness. If you continue to paint on this now, you can see that this is going to keep affecting things. So if you want to modify something like this, this is now going to have a massive effect on the whole thing. So this is just a really simple example of the benefit of nodes, but at the same time, it's also a simple example of the complexity of nodes, because the only thing we've done now, we've really added here a tile, we graded this a little up and down, we masked it down a little bit, and we've done a little bit of painting on top. And you can see that this is already starting to get a little bit confusing. So this is one of the downsides of using nodes as well, is that if you're not careful, this is going to turn into some crazy Italian spaghetti. So this is where you have to organize things. We will, of course, cover techniques for organization, but if you're not careful, this stuff here is going to be incomprehensible. Already just looking at this can get very confusing. Of course, the moment you zoom in, you can start to figure things out. But if you're dealing with the same thing in the layers system, this is not that complicated. But due to the flexibility of the node system, we are going to be sticking with this. And the more you use nodes, the more you're going to start to see the benefit of this. And all these kind of things here, like merging things together, this is not a reason to not use nodes. This is the very topmost area of the interface of nodes. And this is the kind of stuff that just becomes mechanical after a certain time. You're not going to start to really get annoyed at doing these kind of things. It's just becomes something you do, and you start to think in nodes as well after a while. You just have to get used to this. So for now, if you're a little bit scared about using nodes, if you don't really understand them, don't worry. We'll get through all of this in future chapters, and just play around with nodes. Just assume that layers don't really exist, but gone, and just play around them. Just try to make some nodes. You can right click very easily, go to nodes, and you can just find different nodes in this case, and just play around with the different nodes and have fun with that. It does take a bit more time to get used to, because you do actually have to get used to a different way of thinking. The way I think about nodes is that this is essentially just visual programming, in the sense that instead of using just a script that does something, this is essentially just a visual way of doing it. In Nuke, if you've ever been using Nuke, this whole thing is called a script. And if you were to select all of them here, and you can Control C, and if you paste this into something like a notepad, you can get all the code. This doesn't work here, but in Nuke, it's literally a script. So this is just a visual way of doing it. The way you can think about this from a very fundamental level is that you have a node here, and this is doing something. This can be just an image. And this goes into something else, where this can be a grade, and now you're just making this brighter, and this goes into something else, and this here is adding a tileable on top. And then you can use the same image in different places. So this can be a very simple way of doing it. Technically, yes, there are more complicated things in terms of how you have to match this kind of stuff together. But from a very simple point of view, data just flows from left to right. One thing goes into another thing, is being processed here. There's an additional processing happening here, continues in different ways. So yeah, that's layers versus nodes.